I don't think so. Okay, so on Tuesday, I talked sort of in general about modeling and some modeling philosophy. I was going to talk in a little bit more detail about some of the models that have been built that are relevant more specifically to the ocean acidification problem. And so, if you can still see the pointer, what I was going to do is I'll go through a little bit some of the modeling work that's been done on the global carbon cycle and fossil fuels, since that's really the driving force for ocean acidification over the next few decades to centuries. Talk a little bit about modeling that's been done on past and future seawater chemistry. So basically, this is the driving force from the atmosphere. This is the response of the ocean in terms of the chemical response. Look at some of the early work that was done in modeling at looking at feedbacks between climate and carbon cycle and how that might change seawater chemistry, and feedbacks between climate effects and the pH changes, ocean acidification changes. Talk a little bit about calcification and biogeochemistry. Briefly about biological and ecological effects, though there really have not been a lot of detailed models yet, so I'll more be talking about some of the types of models that are out there that it might be relevant to put ocean acidification effects in, and then conclude with a little bit of discussion on policy, economic, and social dimensions, because I think that's an important reason why we're pursuing ocean acidification research is, so what does this mean for people? So this is the same schematic that I started off with on Tuesday, and so I'm going to start by looking at the changes in atmospheric CO2, the physics that gets it into seawater, and the models that have been built to do that component of the problem. So you've all seen this many times throughout the course. The rising atmospheric CO2 is measured at Mauna Loa. This is just the longer part of the paleo ice core data showing the Holocene, where the atmospheric CO2 has been fairly stable over the last 10,000 years. And here was the last glacial period with a fairly large transition increase in atmospheric CO2 as we came out of the glacial period. And then here's the anthropogenic. So what I want to look at a little bit is the information we have on what's actually driving this forcing. So these are some results. It's a combination of data synthesis and numerical models that's being put together by a group called the Global Carbon Project. They've been doing this for the last several years of trying to do annual updates on where we are in terms of fossil fuel emissions, what types of emissions they are, where they're coming from, particular fuels, particular countries, and what are the economic driving factors that are driving this. So in the upper left panel is actually the total fossil fuel emissions by year going back for about the last 20 years. The hatched line is sort of the uncertainty range for the fossil fuel emissions. And although often people give a fossil fuel number with no error bars, there is a small but not unreasonably small error on the fossil fuel emissions. And so it may only be, order 10-15% of fossil fuels, but if you compare it to other components of the carbon sink, it's as large. The uncertainty in the fossil fuels is as large as some of the other components in their entirety. So particularly when we're trying to do things by mass balance, we have fossil fuels, we know the ocean, by difference we're going to get land. These sorts of errors creep in.
Where do they get their fossil fuel emissions? Is it just from countries reporting their fossil fuels?
Some of it is from countries reporting it. Some of it is from other economic data. So, for example, China imports a lot of coal from Australia. So you don't just depend upon the Chinese numbers. You also use export numbers.
Do they ever use radiocarbon? Because there's a new initiative where they're using radiocarbon to determine the amount of fossil fuels.
In the Global Carbon Project, we're not using radiocarbon directly, but there are attempts to do that. But that's, there are approaches for doing that. But we're not folding that into this analysis yet. Just to give you an idea, so one of the things that I think has been interesting is there has been a fairly rapid rise in emissions over the last decade. All these colored lines are the different scenarios that had been put together about a decade ago by IPCC to try to, they're stories that IPCC uses for doing future projections. And we've been at or above the most dire of the emissions scenarios that IPCC had put together. And part of that has to do with the distribution of where energy is being used. This is dividing the world up into two groups. Annex B, which is Annex B is the group that the Kyoto Protocol would have dealt with. The Kyoto Protocol was looking at the developed world, so Japan, the US, and Western Europe. The non-Annex B is the rest of the world, in particular the big players are China and India. And what we've seen over the last decade is that the Annex B emissions have been relatively flat, but we're seeing a really steep increase in the non-Annex B. And so you may have seen headlines, China is now past the US as the major carbon emitter. One of the interesting things that comes out of the economic data is that one of the reasons why China is doing this, not too big of a surprise if you ever drive to Walmart, is that Europe and the US have shipped their manufacturing, have basically outsourced their manufacturing to China. So a lot of this growth is not the internal Chinese economy, it's their external economy of trade. And so a lot of these CO2 emissions are associated with products that are produced for trade. Coal has gone up quite a bit, and this is mostly for electricity generation. This is pretty disturbing because on a carbon basis, coal is the dirtiest fuel per energy. And a lot of this is associated with building power plants in the third world. And what you see is, in terms of looking at emissions per person, we've actually started to go up again. And some of this has to do with economic development. As you start to bring less developed countries up to a higher economic standard, it's tied into energy use. And when they don't have access to other energy sources, they're going to use fossil fuels. And so when we project into the future, it's really the behavior of the developing world and their attempt to raise their economic standard that's going to be probably the biggest player over the next few decades in terms of where these emissions go. I should say this is our projection. This is 2008. This is our projection for 2009. Even with the global recession, there hasn't been it's not an enormous impact on fossil fuel emissions. We also in this project have been looking at where the carbon goes. So this is the atmospheric growth rate based on observations. This is the land sink, and this is the ocean sink. We have looked at both the fossil fuel and cement emissions. This is just a smooth version of the curve I showed you before, and also land use change. So this is deforestation, primarily in the tropics. And when you combine the deforestation source with the land sink, this is the land sink separate from the deforestation, in net the land is pretty close to zero. It has been increasing slightly above the deforestation, but there is some cancellation between the deforestation emissions and the land uptake. A lot of the variability we see in the atmosphere, we're pretty convinced now, is driven by the land, and it has to do, a lot of it's due to El Nino Southern Oscillation variations and drought. Drought leading to release of carbon, both in terms of plants not taking up as much as they normally do, and an increased frequency of fire. So on year-to-year variations, the land is very important, but clearly the ocean plays a big role on long timescales. Looking to the future, we have to know something about how society is going to behave. So it's questions about population growth, a lot to do with economic development, because it's really bringing up the developing world to higher economic standards that drives a lot of energy use. you need to understand something about policy implications. Will there be treaties to limit and control emissions? Will they be effective? Will there be technological advances? Right now, nobody has a good crystal ball. And so what the climate community does and what we're going to have to do as an OA community is run a set of scenarios or stories and be able to tell society and policymakers, if we are on this storyline, this would be the impact. If we were on another storyline, this would be the impact. But we don't have really good evidence to put probability distributions on future emissions as of yet. This is just a range of emissions. These are what are called representative concentration pathways. So each one of the colors is one sort of main storyline, and then there are a variety of sub-storylines or variants around each of those. And these are the storylines that are going to be used in the next IPCC. And you see most of the storylines have increasing emissions through the mid-century. The red and the green in particular are storylines where there's a very aggressive attempt to limit carbon emissions. And in fact, in the green, even to start actively removing carbon from the atmosphere through technological means, either through reforestation or by carbon capture and storage, where you would pull carbon out of the atmosphere and put it into a geological reservoir. To give you an idea of the range, it's everywhere from, we're just about 390 right now. The very low end of some of these storylines has us stabilizing around maybe going up to about 430, 440, and then stabilizing. Others have us going up to about 900 with a wide range. And I say there's no probability in here. These are just stories, and that's what we have to work with right now. One advance over the way things have been done in the past is it used to be that a group of people would put together the emissions. That would then be used for radiative forcing for climate models or CO2 concentrations. People would do climate projections, and then people would look at impacts, adaptation. Things like ocean acidification would be considered an impact or a vulnerability. What we're trying to do separately this time is the climate community put together a set of these representative concentration pathways, or RCPs, and then the social economic modelers attempted to for each of those stories, fit an economic pathway that could actually get there. At the same time, the climate modelers are using these to drive scenarios, and there's actually two-way talk now where there didn't used to be. It used to be very linear. And then all of this information on both economics and climate is going to go into the impacts. The reason why this is pretty important is to get to, for example, to get to some of these green curves where you get a lot of uptake, you may not need to use, for example, a lot of biofuels. So if you're going to use biofuels, you've got a rising population, you're taking arable land and using it for biofuels. Well, quickly you find that there's not enough land to both feed people and to do your biofuel and to match the energy constraints of some of these pathways. And then you have climate impacts on top of that. It might be harder to grow food. And so you need to sort of, instead of looking at it as separate problems, we need to start looking at the human dimension directly, particularly on the land, but there are also ocean aspects of that we're going to have to start looking at. Depending upon, and these are an older group of scenarios, these are a range of atmospheric scenarios that were used in the last few IPCCs. Depending upon the range of emissions, you get quite a range of CO2 concentrations, which is going to lead to a range in ocean acidification. And I think if somebody asks you, what are the big factors that are going to determine at least the chemistry changes over the century, the honest thing is us. It's what choices we're going to make on emissions. At least for surface waters stay in pretty close equilibrium with the atmosphere. And so we can predict fairly easily, if we know the emissions, we can derive the CO2 concentration, and we can tell you what the ocean acidification is going to be, but we don't know what the emissions are, and that's the major source of uncertainty. These are some maps that Sarah actually put together from some modeling work that we've been doing, and it's going to be in a special issue of Oceanography magazine that's hopefully going to come out, knock on wood, in December. It better, otherwise, somebody's going to be looking for their check back. And this is just showing for pH. I'll start down here. This is the GLODAP data that we were talking about yesterday. So this is a mid-1990s annual climatology for the globe. This is the gridded product that's been interpolated. This is a comparison of the model to the GLODAP for the GLODAP period. And what you see is there are regions where we have biases, both positive and negative. The model's not perfect. We tend to have problems in regions of very strong biology near the coast and also some issues in the Southern Ocean. But given those biases, and then you can compare to the amount of change you see over time, the biases are probably relatively minimal since most of the change is driven by the atmosphere. And what you see is very striking decreases in pH as you move forward in time. And so this is for surface waters. There's some spatial variations that has to do with the seawater chemistry, but the big trend is driven by the atmosphere, so driven by the choice we made in the emissions scenario. We can also look at, this is the saturation state for aragonite. Again, the model has some familiar bias patterns associated with errors in the circulation and the biology. None of these models are perfect, and in fact, as you go to models of increasing complexity, so this is actually a coupled ocean-atmosphere model. So it's running a carbon cycle, it's running a climate cycle, it's got land vegetation, it's got an ocean. It's trying to do the whole thing at once. Often what happens is any particular aspect of the simulation is a little worse than if you were to just focus on the ocean or just focus on the land. But you get to look at these coupled dynamics and these coupled behaviors. And again, I'm sure you saw some of this last week, is as you move forward in time, the lower saturations are in the oranges and red, and what you see as you move forward to the end of the 21st century is large regions of the Arctic, Southern Ocean, and parts of the North and Pacific and North Atlantic that become undersaturated for aragonite, and also substantial changes in the tropics that have gone from values up in the range of 4 down here into the 2 to 2.5 range, which is below what some people suggest is adequate for maintaining a coral reef. So that even though the water is still super saturated for aragonite, on balance, the coral reef won't be able to calcify enough on net to be able to have a net positive balance. This is a somewhat earlier simulation that we did with a group in Bern, Switzerland. Came out a little earlier this year, where we're using the same sort of coupled ocean atmosphere carbon climate model. And we were looking in particular, excuse me, at the Arctic. There had been quite a bit of work done talking about the Southern Ocean and the potential impacts of OA on the Southern Ocean, but very little work on the Arctic because there hadn't been observations. We were able to get our hands on some observations to be able to validate our model in that region. And we were looking in particular at the arrival of undersaturated water at high latitudes in the Arctic. This is on the annual mean. When would the annual mean go undersaturated? This would be sort of the annual minimum. When would be the first, period where for a month or so each year you'd start to see undersaturation. And at least for this choice, we looked at 2 different atmospheric scenarios. We were seeing substantial undersaturation, at least during part of the year in the Arctic, as early as 2016 in one scenario, 2020, 2022 in another scenario. So this is, if you're looking at geochemical thresholds, actually rather frightening that the Arctic is going to start to be undersaturated on a regular basis in the quite near future. This is a slightly older paper by Orr et al. Many of you may have seen this. In Orr et al., we were looking at both the surface undersaturation patterns. Here the colors are reversed, so here blue is undersaturated. But also in the subsurface and looking at the shoaling of saturation horizons. So this is where, for the surface, we can do a lot of work. Models are helpful, but for the subsurface, they're really critical because you need to know about the pathways and ventilation rates for anthropogenic CO2 to get into the ocean. And so this is just a comparison for the Atlantic in the top, in the middle row, and the Pacific in the bottom row, looking at the shoaling of the aragonite saturation horizon. And so what you see is, by the end of the century, large regions of the North Atlantic that were supersaturated would now be undersaturated, and similarly in the North Pacific. And this is important when you're looking at non-planktonic species, when we're looking at, say, deep corals, to give an idea of where are regions most vulnerable, where are they most threatened. So what we've been trying to construct are models that really link several different moving parts at the same time. So you have changing climate, so you've got atmospheric CO2, but you also have changes in ocean circulation, changes in sea ice, changes in temperature. So it's not just that the CO2 is going to change, there's going to be synergistic effects and antagonistic effects between CO2 and other components of the climate system. That's going to feed back on the ocean CO2 sink, both in terms of the atmospheric forcing, but how ocean circulation is going to change. You're going to have also indirect effects of climate on all the ecological components you could think of at the organism level, biodiversity, biogeography, organism physiology, both from climate and ocean acidification. And then that's going to feed back into biogeochemistry, ecosystems, and eventually down into ecosystem services, things like fisheries, coral reef as a habitat. So one of the things we can do in these models is we can start to look at these couplings between carbon cycle and climate more explicitly. This is, again, with a slightly older version of the model we work with, where we drove the model with two different atmospheric emission trajectories. So these are CO2 emissions, one a very high trajectory, and one a stabilization, a very aggressive stabilization trajectory. This is the range of CO2. As you add CO2 to these models, you start to warm the climate, you start to increase and warm the surface ocean, and you also change the freshwater balance, both because you're melting sea ice, so there's a lot less sea ice there, but you're also changing the water cycle. Where's water evaporated? Warm water will evaporate more water vapor, and so you tend to strengthen the water cycle, particularly in regions that are already rainy. So most of these models suggest that regions that are already have high rainfall will have more intense and larger rainfall. And so at high latitudes, you'll start to warm the water, and it'll also freshen because you're melting more ice, you have more rainfall. That tends to stratify the water column. It makes it more difficult for mixing to occur, makes it more difficult for deep water formation to occur. So this is showing for these two different model runs. Here's our control, here's the warming that's occurring, and this is a measure of the overturning circulation in the Atlantic, and that tends to slow down because of this increase in stratification. There's quite a large range when we look at different models in the predictions of how important ocean CO2 uptake is going to be, and how important and how big these sort of climate feedbacks. We would expect, as we start to, say, slow the overturning circulation in the North Atlantic, that we're going to take up less anthropogenic carbon. So that could actually slow ocean acidification, at least for deep waters. So slow the rate that anthropogenic CO2 is going to penetrate into the ocean. But on the other hand, it also increases the amount of CO2 in the atmosphere. So surface waters might be experiencing more ocean acidification because atmospheric CO2 is higher. Subsurface waters might be seeing less. So it's a difference in the partitioning in the vertical of where the CO2 ends up. This is a comparison that we did for the last IPCC assessment, where we compared all the carbon and climate models that were out there, and we looked at the oceanic uptake, and there was about a 30% range for the same atmospheric CO2 trajectory, emissions trajectory, about a 30% uncertainty in how much CO2 was going to be taken up by the oceans. And then there was a very substantial range for these climate feedbacks. As we warm the ocean, will the ocean take up more or less carbon? All the models said that the ocean would take up less carbon as the planet got warmer, but there was quite a range between some that were quite sensitive and some that were quite sensitive and some that were quite insensitive. To give you an idea, this red bar in both is about 20 years of current emissions. So if you're talking to a policymaker and they say, we want to stabilize atmospheric CO2 at 450. We've been told if we don't do that, the world will collapse. And they want to know, how much can we emit? What emission trajectory should we be on in order to stabilize at 450? Well, since the ocean's a major sink, you need to actually have pretty good confidence in how big the ocean sink's going to be in order to give them the information they need for what emission pathway they should be on. So this is where a lot of work has been going on, and this is basically the group of models that people are using for looking at ocean acidification projections in the future. These climate feedbacks will also affect ocean acidification, not just because of atmospheric CO2, but also because of other components. So for example, if you look in the future, I should just show, this is a map that we put together from an early simulation looking at where would the big changes be as you warm the planet in terms of where the ocean would store anthropogenic CO2. The blues are regions that would store less as the planet gets warmer, and it had to do with deep water formation regions. So down in the Southern Ocean and in the North Atlantic, regions that right now take up a lot of anthropogenic CO2, they would take up less, and that would then propagate down the boundaries. This is the deep western boundary current. So these are the regions that are most sensitive, at least in this model, to changes in climate.
Scott, what's going on in the Gulf of Mexico?
Yeah, that's interesting. There's a change in a local change in the circulation pattern because of how strong the deep western boundary current is, and so you have these regional effects that are somewhat offsetting because we've changed the amount of ventilating water that's coming in from the strength and the water mass properties in the deep western boundary current. To be honest, given the resolution of the model, I'm not sure how confident I am on that, but it would be interesting to do a regional model, take one of these global models and then do a regional downscaling into the Gulf of Mexico. The Gulf of Mexico didn't get looked at much in WOS because it wasn't considered ocean. We don't even put Argo floats in the Gulf of Mexico, which is kind of interesting. But in terms of OA, so there's going to be less carbon in some regions, but there's offsets. So for example, this is looking at the impact on delta pH, the change in pH due to DIC impacts and sea surface temperature impacts. And the planet's getting warmer, but you're also adding more carbon, and it ends up being a net wash. So for pH, these climate feedbacks where you're changing carbon and temperature at the same time don't tend to have a big effect. The dominant effect for pH is just the growth in atmospheric CO2. We don't need to worry about these sort of subtle feedbacks of, the ocean doesn't take up as much carbon, so the atmosphere is a little higher. It tends to wash out. For aragonite, the SST and the DIC tend to work in the same direction, and so you do have to pay attention to these feedbacks. One of the things that we found when we started looking in the Arctic, this is just showing, these are the carbon climate feedbacks for pH. For most of the ocean, they're a wash, but when we started to look in the Arctic, we saw that there actually is a big impact on pH. And we actually saw the opposite sign for saturation. For most of the ocean, these blue colors actually mean that the climate feedbacks actually reduce the size of the ocean acidification impact, but in the Arctic it actually got larger. And it had to do with changes in freshwater distributions and sea ice in the Arctic. And so as you change sea ice, you have more open ocean areas, you get more CO2 invading, more anthropogenic CO2 invading. You also have fresher water, so you have lower alkalinities, and so you're adding more anthropogenic carbon, you have lower alkalinity to buffer that, and so you end up getting a bigger ocean acidification effect. And so this is actually one of the things that's driving this prediction of a very early ocean acidification signal in the Arctic are warming impacts and feedbacks through sea ice and fresh water. There also could be feedbacks through biology and changes in the export production of carbon. And this is just showing, this is a paper that's in discussion in Biogeosciences, where we took several different models that were forecasting into the future and tried to see if there's some commonality in the changes they predict for primary production. So the background colors here are the sort of prediction, the ensemble of 3 different models in primary production. So high in the North Atlantic, North Pacific, along the equator, and in parts of the Southern Ocean. These are the predictions for the change, in primary production. So the blues are regions where primary production is predicted to go down. So in the subtropics, as the water gets warmer, they tend to be low nutrient environments. You've reduced mixing, so there's not as much nutrient coming up from below, and you tend to drive less biology, less primary production, less export production. But in some high latitude regions, you actually get more, you get more biology, more primary production. And in these regions, some of these regions were actually light limited, either because of deep mixing or because of sea ice coverage. And so as you melt the sea ice back, as you stratify the water column, you tend to reduce that light limitation. And so at high latitudes, you might actually get more biological uptake. And so those sort of regional differences seem to be holding across a number of different models in terms of where we expect biology to become stronger and where we expect it to become weaker. The other thing we might be interested in is that we can get from models is air-sea CO2 fluxes, and where are we seeing changes in the patterns of air-sea CO2 flux. And this is a compilation. This is also from the Le Carré paper that's going to come out next week. 1 p.m. on Tuesday, if anybody's interested. One of the things that we're seeing from observations is that in the Southern Ocean, and at least in parts of the North Atlantic, the ocean appears to be, the change in PCO2 in the ocean with time appears to be faster than the atmosphere, at least for the last decade or so. Some of this may have to do with natural climate variability, different climate modes, but some of it may have to do with these atmospheric, with some of these climate feedbacks. And so we're starting to look at the trends in the observations and the trends in the models to see if we're starting to be able to see some of these climate feedbacks where we'd expect a more stratified ocean, changes in circulation, to start to see a reduced increase or reduced uptake in CO2. A positive here is, since this is the sea to air difference, if this is positive, it tends to reduce the amount of anthropogenic CO2 that's being taken up. So I've been talking mostly about seawater chemistry. Where are we in terms of modeling? And let me just summarize that. I think we have pretty good model estimates for how seawater chemistry is going to change as atmospheric CO2 rises. We have some handle on how climate feedbacks might be impacting seawater chemistry. But we still have a lot of questions about the role of biology and how changes in ecosystem properties might change the distribution of carbon in the water column. In terms of how seawater chemistry may be affecting biology, There have been a number of simulations, but we're still, I think, in the infancy, and I'll sort of go through that. There have been, to start with, have been over the last decade a number of papers that have attempted to simulate the distribution of calcifying species in the ocean. So the first step is you need to have some baseline model for how calcification is occurring in the ocean, and then you need to apply these chemical factors that might be altering that calcification, if that's the primary thing you're interested in. If you were interested in some other impact of OA, you'd need to also, for example, nitrogen fixation, if you want to follow up on Dave Hutchinson's work, then you need to have a model that has a pretty good representation of nitrogen fixation in the modern ocean that you could then apply these projections for how ocean acidification and rising PCO2 may increase nitrogen fixation. This is a statistical model that relates coccolithophore distributions to things like mixed layer depth, temperature, and nutrients. This was put together by Deborah Iglesias Rodriguez, who was here last week. And she was looking at the distribution in the modern ocean. This is for summer, so you see coccolithophore blooms in both the North Pacific and the North Atlantic. And then she ran the same statistical model into the future. And this didn't have any ocean acidification effects. This was just trying to look at the niche of where coccolithophores are now in terms of temperature space, mixed layer depth space. And then in the future, as you get a warmer climate. And so I think one of the things we have to be careful about is that OA is not the only impact that's going to impact calcifiers. I'm not saying that this is the correct prediction, but I am saying that these organisms are also going to be sensitive to changes in ocean circulation, changes in temperature, changes in fresh water, changes in nutrient supply. And so OA, you really need to fold this in, and you need to look at both aspects. We can't look at OA independent of these other factors. A number of people have tried to take what is often rather noisy data for how biological systems respond. This is a modeling paper that Gellin wrote a couple of years ago, where they tried to take as a function of saturation state for planktonic systems what the relationship of inorganic carbon to organic carbon would be, and then tried to take this red curve and then put it in their model and use that. So the other thing is the modeling community is really dependent upon the sorts of perturbation experiments that are done. The more we can understand how biological systems respond to these perturbations, the more confidence we have in that, the more we can be able to assess using models what might behave in the future. Now, of course, all the caveats that this is being done for short-term incubations, but when we want to apply over multiple decades, we really want to know what the long-term acclimation of the entire system is and whether there'll be either acclimation or true adaptation to rising CO2. So to go into a little bit more specifics, the way these models are being done of including calcification, some people assume a fixed relationship between inorganic and organic carbon. So for every 1 mole of organic carbon, there might be 0.2 moles of inorganic carbon produced. People are using statistical models where they've looked at the kind of empirical relationships of where they see coccolithophores and then applying that to the model. Or they might actually have a truly dynamic model where you have calcifiers actually growing in the model as a separate group, and you would have model parameterizations and functions for how that's working. The prognostic models depend on light, mixed layer depth, sea surface temperature, nutrients, grazing, just like the kind of simple ecosystem models I talked about before. Most of the models so far have used coccolithophorids as the major functional group. There have been a few papers that have attempted to model foraminifera and pteropods, but most of the groups are simply looking at this component. If pteropods have aragonodic shells, where coccoliths and forams have calcitic shells, so from a biogeochemical point of view, they're very different because the pteropods tend to dissolve much shallower in the water column. These may also respond quite a bit different. These are both zooplankton. where this is a phytoplankton, where it's also being impacted by rising CO2. So there's conflicting results within coccolithophores, so how it's going to respond under atmospheric CO2. So we really need to move forward and build in more specific functional groups for these different components. And there's lots of data limitations. We just don't have a lot of field data to be able to assess the distribution of, forams, pteropods. We want to understand their seasonal variation globally. There are some ways of doing coccolithophores from space and also from some long transects like the Atlantic Meridional Transect and the AMT that the British run. And this is showing just one. This is Watson Gregg's model on the left and Barney Balch's satellite product on the right. And you can see, my joke the other day, well, it looks pretty good in some spots, not so good in others. But we're starting to at least getting some tools to assess current calcification rates and put those into the models. There are, of course, some geochemical constraints as well, because we can look at the alkalinity balance for the ocean and the alkalinity budget. Calcification in the surface water is going to reduce alkalinity. It's going to increase alkalinity in the subsurface. And this is a recent synthesis of how much calcification is occurring in terms of petagrams per year, and then where is it being remineralized, with a lot of it being remineralized shallow in the water column. So we're starting to get a handle on those global rates and patterns, which would then lay a baseline which we could then use to validate the models and then use the models for future projections. There are feedbacks that are going to occur not just in terms of water carbon chemistry, but feedbacks that might occur on calcification. Excuse me. So, right now, when you draw down organic matter, you reduce the PCO2 in the surface water. But when you draw down alkalinity, you actually increase the PCO2 in the surface water. And so if we had a change in calcification, you could actually alter the oceanic uptake of CO2 because this impact on calcification. It's pretty small, though. This was some work that Christoph Heinze did. He looked at what if you had a 50% drop in calcification, you only got a change in atmospheric CO2 of about 10 parts per million. Now, if you remember the range of scenarios I was showing, we were looking at values between 400 and 700 up to 900 parts per million. So I don't think this is going to be a big player. This is going to be a big player in terms of feedbacks on atmospheric CO2, but it's probably something we want to have for completeness in the models. So other places that ocean acidification could affect biogeochemistry, so you have this reduced formation of biogenic calcium carbonate. You may also change the behavior of sinking particle material. So there are a number of conceptual models that argue that a lot of the organic matter is being dragged down into the deep ocean because of ballast material, having diatoms with heavy siliceous shells, having forams and coccoliths that provide ballast through calcium carbonate, add weight to the organic matter to sink it into the deep ocean. If you have a reduction in biogenic calcification, that would also change the behavior in the subsurface ocean of that sinking organic matter. That would also be something we would want to look at and include in the models. Yeah?
Is there any evidence with the changing mineralization rates? Like sequence ratios or that nature?
Is there, sorry, I can't hear very well.
Remineralization rates, right? Red field ratios.
Oh, red field ratios or remineralization rates? There is the work that Dave Hutchins talked about in terms of the mesocosm experiments in Bergen showed that for under high CO2, you tended to get higher carbon to nutrient ratios. But as Dave also showed, there's a variety of other studies that show, some of them show the opposite direction. And I'll show one model simulation that people have taken some of that and actually played with that. I don't, off the top of my head, I haven't seen any direct ocean acidification studies that have shown a change in either the length scale or the rate of remineralization for sinking particles, but certainly some theoretical arguments would suggest that's true. You would also expect a more rapid dissolution of calcium carbonate in the subsurface. We're going to be shoaling the undersaturation horizons, shoaling that omega equals 1 horizon. So we'd expect aragonite in particular to dissolve much shallower in the water column. So there's good theoretical, but I don't know of any field data because you'd have to actually manipulate CO2 on sinking particles, which is a non-trivial task. So this is some work by Andres Oschlies. This is building on that paper by Ulf Riebesell, where they saw this increase in, as they increased CO2, the carbon to nutrient nitrogen ratios actually increased. And so they took the mesocosm results and plugged that into a model. And what they saw was that for their model, as you moved forward into the future, the amount of export production actually went down because of stratification. Warmer world, less nutrient supply, less export production. But when they scaled it so that the amount of carbon actually went up per mole of nitrogen. So you could think of this as each mole of nitrogen is more effective at sucking carbon out of the atmosphere, at producing organic matter because of these higher C/N ratios. Export production actually went the other way. So all the models without the OA effect are showing a decrease in export production. They actually saw an increase of export production in terms of carbon. What that did was you had more organic carbon sinking, you had more remineralization, you got a reduction in oxygen in the globe, and a very big increase in the volume of the oxygen minimum zones. So you got bigger oxygen minimum zones because you had more carbon coming down and being remineralized, more denitrification, and then a feedback on nitrogen fixation. So this would be a pretty big, feedback on biogeochemistry because of ocean acidification. And it actually could exacerbate climate warming because if you get a lot more denitrification, you might be getting a lot more nitrous oxide production. So, but this is the using models to test hypotheses. This was based on basically one set of experiments done in a bag, a 5 cubic meter bag off of Norway. Let's extrapolate that to the world. That's what modelers do. We get to have fun. But it's certainly something to be aware of and think of. In terms of ecology and ecosystem dynamics and biodiversity, one of the things to think about is where are the ecological niches that organisms are living in right now. So if you were to look at sea surface temperature, so you have warm in the tropics, cold at the poles, we're warming everywhere, and what we're seeing is a push of niches and a push of the ranges of organisms poleward. We're seeing this in zooplankton species, we're seeing this in fish. Their ranges are contracting on the tropical side and expanding on the poleward side. It's because they're being driven. If you want to stay at the same temperature, you got to move towards the poles. Things are a little different for ocean acidification. So if you were thinking about saturation state is high in the tropics currently because of the warmer temperatures. Remember those maps? The tropics tend to be supersaturated. They tend to be undersaturated or closer to saturation at the poles. We're pushing this down with time. And so what we're actually doing, if you want to maintain the same saturation state, you got to move towards the equator. And so you've got these conflicting pushes. You've got one press, the ecologists would call this a long-term press, from sea surface temperature that would be pushing your habitat poleward, but the seawater chemistry would be pushing you equatorward. And so it's really a question of, are we going to be looking at, you can't just translocate and say, well, everything will just move poleward. It's getting warmer, everything will move poleward. We're actually going to have places where the niche that the organism is currently living in, when you think about both physics and chemistry, won't be there anymore. And how will they adapt and evolve and acclimate to these changes in niches? So there hasn't been a lot of work. People have started to put in some OA effects, but there hasn't been a lot of ecological effects on ocean acidification. People have put in, coccolithophores in models. I mentioned that. But they haven't started to look at the full interactions across multiple species. What's going to be the impact on coccolithophores, forams, bacteria, different types of zooplankton? How's that going to feed through the trophic interaction? But this is clearly some of the next steps. Right now, we're pretty data limited. We could get up to even more sophisticated models where we'd actually be looking at specific fish moving up into the higher trophic levels of squid, jellyfish. This, again, is right now fairly data limited, but this is the kind of information that policy managers are really asking for, because they are worried about, say, a particular fishery, they're worried about a protected species, they're worried about ecosystem services, and it's very hard to connect with them when you're talking about, phytoplankton. Well, phytoplankton's going to go up or down. Well, their answer is, well, I don't care about phytoplankton. My responsibility is to manage this particular ecosystem or this particular species. And so we're going to have to start folding in ocean acidification effects into more sophisticated models of a variety of different types. I did want to say that there has been some work on regional models. This is some results. This is a model that Nikki Gruber has run for the California current system. There have been a variety of others that Claudine Haury, I don't know if Haury has analyzed to look at the small scale and regional variations in seawater chemistry. So here's California, here's the Central Valley of California, and what you see is when you have upwelling of the CO2-rich water, you have low pH water along the coast that's then swept out into filaments by the physical circulation. And so to make connections again to stakeholders, policymakers, we really need to be making models on the scales of the regions that they're trying to manage. And so we really need to start looking at regional models. This is a similar one. This is from Blackford and Gilbert. This is for the North Sea. So here's England, Belgium, Netherlands, looking at large variations in pH on a seasonal basis in the North Sea because of river inputs, where you have fresh water coming in that can cause big spikes in carbonate chemistry. And so I think there's a lot of room for a lot of applications, both policy-oriented and scientific, excuse me, in developing regional models where we can look at regional variations in seawater chemistry and then regional simulations in the biology. Hang on a sec. There's a class of models I really didn't get to talk much about on Tuesday, but may be very relevant for some aspects of the ocean acidification problem, particularly if you're looking at either zooplankton larvae, or meroplankton, the juveniles of a lot of benthic organisms spend a period of time in the meroplankton, and they may be more sensitive during that stage to ocean acidification. And so there's been a rich history of what's called individual-based models, where people put in, sorry if these don't show up, each one of these little dots is actually a particle that's been put in that's meant to represent a group of larvae. And you can actually, this is a time slice of larvae that are leaving the coast. The coast is here at 0 and being swept offshore. And some of them are then getting swept near shore and then can settle and find a place to live. This is very true both for coral reefs and for a lot of benthic mollusks, that in order to understand recruitment, you need to follow the larval stages and actually track them. And along the way, not just the circulation, but how the biology is changing, their food source might be changing, ocean acidification might be changing. And so there's a rich history of they're often called IBMs for individual base models, but they're really just particle tracking models. And you can start to give the models behavior. So for example, each one of these dots, they could vertically migrate if that's what the larvae do. And they're feeding within the model. And you kind of start to get results like this. This is a particular IBM where they've put in a bunch of different dots. These are all different larvae particles. But what you see is that some of these larvae, they tend to survive best in some regions, both because of the circulation, but their behavior. And some of them tend to grow better. So the big dots here are ones that have put on a lot more weight and are growing faster. So you can actually use these models to look at, if you're studying a coral reef, where is the recruitment coming from? And how is the recruitment being affected by changing circulation, changing biology, changing chemistry? Yeah?
Aren't a lot of those models based on Lagrangian
Yeah.
dynamics, and so they're along the shore, right? And you kind of unidirectional
The particle tracking is just another word for Lagrangian. I did have Lagrangian in here, but the title was too long. Lagrangian just means that it's following a water parcel. It doesn't say anything about what the flow field is. And I guess what I'm trying to show from this example is a lot of the most recent work on this has been looking at fully turbulent flow. And so I think where IBMs do the best is when they're in high resolution regional models where you're actually including the turbulent flow. Because that's what the larvae are actually experiencing. Yeah?
I was going to say, I think Alan Shanks does really cool, like, larval tracking stuff with turbulent flow. But also, they're starting to do IBMs for nutrition of larvae. So tracking, if you've got this amount of lipid and
Right. Right. That's actually this is the bachelor model is actually tracking, growth of the individual larvae, which depends upon the dynamics of what they're feeding on, but also things like lipid stores. And yes, you can put very complex life stages. So you can actually have for copepod models when they molt and when they're as they're evolving through different larval stages. So these are very powerful tools for some applications. So I just wanted to wrap up and talk a little bit about ecosystem services. One of the reasons why society funds us is because they want to know answers to specific questions. It's not just because what we do is really cool. And there's a variety of different things that are going to be affected by acidification. For fisheries, we're going to be altering, say, plankton dynamics. Coccolithophores, pteropods, food sources, which might move up through the food chain. You've seen a lot of evidence for impacts of ocean acidification on mollusks and crustaceans. Many of these are directly part of rich fisheries. And then also reefs as a critical habitat for supporting fisheries and other ecosystem services. So reefs also protect shorelines. And then they're also very important for ecotourism, and which is an important ecosystem service. So there's lots of different reasons of ecosystem services that are going to be impacted by ocean acidification. If you're really interested, Sarah has a nice article that's going to come out in this Oceanography magazine that goes through a lot of the details. It's difficult, though, to always give valuations. There's always a push you can say, okay, here's this ecosystem service, and somebody says, okay, well, give me a dollar number. How many jobs are going to be lost? How many dollars are going to be lost from the economy? And it's often difficult. These ecosystem services provide important services that often can't be replaced technologically. And particularly as they start to be impacted, their value actually goes up because there's less of it. There's much less of it, but it's something that's almost irreplaceable. There's lots of issues of moral choices in here as well as economic choices. And economics is not always, economics and ethics and morals don't always play well together. And so there are questions about, there are economic ecosystem services that are being provided now that might not exist 50 or 100 years from now, but the people who would benefit from those don't get a vote. They're not born yet. And so there are issues of intergenerational equity and also social justice of, where are the biggest impacts going to be? Some of the biggest social and economic impacts might be in the developing world and the tropics, where they're very dependent upon, say, coral reefs, where we're may see big impacts on ocean acidification, but those are not the same places that are doing the largest CO2 emissions. And so how do you balance that? There was a great picture I saw for the Prime Minister of the Maldives Islands, and his cabinet held a cabinet meeting in scuba gear underwater. And it was basically a photo op before Copenhagen. They're very worried about sea level rise, and their argument was, if you don't do something, this is where we're going to have our meetings, because there won't be any island left. For them, it's really a catastrophic loss, where in the U.S., sea level rise is important, but perhaps less catastrophic. So how do you balance those? Sarah has a nice paper that came out earlier in the year looking for U.S. fisheries of what are the species that might be sensitive and how does that translate into current revenue dollars. Revenue is not the only economic measure you want to look at. There are issues of actual net economic benefit, but this sort of data is at least a first stab at looking at sensitivity or susceptibility. And what's interesting is, in terms of tonnage, things like mollusks, shellfish, crustaceans aren't a huge ton of fish. If you're interested in tonnage of fish, you're going to go look at pollock and things like that. But in terms of value, in terms of revenue, the reds are all mollusks, the yellows are crustacean, lobsters, shrimps, crabs, and in some regions they're actually the dominant valuation for the fishery in terms of revenue. So this first column here is New England, and about 80% of the value of the New England fishery, which is one of the largest in the country, is because of a mix of scallops, clams, lobsters, and crabs. And so there's a potential for a large sensitivity to fisheries, to ocean acidification in terms of its economic impact. Globally, and now these are tonnage numbers, and this is from Sarah's paper that'll come out in a few weeks. Again, broken down by species, there are some regions that have substantial tonnage due to these ocean acidification sensitive species. We're working on trying to put some valuation there. It's harder to get valuation for a lot of species outside the U.S., or a lot of fisheries outside the U.S., but that's one direction we're trying to work. You might also be interested in what countries depend upon seafood, and this is just ranking where countries get as a percent of, so this is seafood as a percent of total protein, and the darker colors are countries that depend quite heavily on seafood, either wild capture or aquaculture, which also might be sensitive to ocean acidification, as a protein source. And then we also looked particularly at mollusks, because we're pretty sure that although there's conflicting results for crustaceans, all the mollusk data shows a sensitivity to acidification and a degradation under acidification. So we can start to look at not just globally what is this going to affect, but what regions might be particularly hardest hit, whether it's wild catch wild fisheries or aquaculture, and start to try to develop biological experiments that target those fisheries, models that target those fisheries, and social economic studies that target those fisheries to really bring together and integrate across the whole range of OA research what might be the social and economic impacts. So this is just my last slide, and I'll wrap up. In terms of the uncertainties in future projections, I realize this is a little small, but I wanted to put it all on one slide. You guys can stare at it in more detail later. I'll just sort of summarize if we know what atmospheric emission trajectories are, we can tell you with some confidence what the seawater chemistry changes are going to be. There may also be some impacts in coastal waters due to other changes in acidity and alkalinity due to river runoff of nutrients, acid rainfall. But for the globe, we're pretty confident we can, at least medium confidence that we can give you the changes in seawater chemistry. It gets harder to understand these calcification and biogeochemical impacts. We can take what limited data we have right now, and we do think we're going to see changes in biogeochemistry. I think some of the big questions are things like the Redfield stoichiometries and nitrogen fixation, perhaps trace gases. Those are things that can have fairly dramatic feedbacks, either through the carbon cycle itself, through, for example, low oxygen zones, or nitrogen fixation as adding a nutrient source and really stimulating biology. A lot less capability right now in terms of making predictions in terms of either biological effects on individual organisms or ecological effects as we start to pull together and look at food web interactions. And then we're just starting to look at the policy and economic and social dimensions. And I think a lot of that is going to be dependent upon doing targeted studies across the spectrum of OA research to look in particular, I guess what I would like to say is, this is not just a basic science question of how is the ocean going to respond. It really is science that's inspired by true needs. There are true, important social questions that we need to answer, and we need to answer them in the next few decades. And that should be one of the motivating factors for some of the research we're doing, even if it's basic research on how do corals biomineralize. That's going to tell us something that we need to know for protecting coral reefs. So I'll stop there and take questions and hopefully still have a voice. Excuse me. Glenn, I got my tea.
Yeah, a couple questions. But one is related to what do you make in terms of the hiatus of the past 10 years in terms of warming that we're seeing from the debate?
Well, I wouldn't use the phrase hiatus. There's a lot of, I could dig around and find the slides. If you go back and you look at the climate warming record, there are periods of substantial warming and cooling. There was a nice paper in GRL a few months ago. I'll have to look it up, but I can send it to the class, that sort of took and looked, just like if you were looking at the stock market, there's big trends, but there's short-term variability. The same has been true for temperature. And you can go back and look over the last 40 years, what's the probability of getting a 10-year period where you get either no warming or flat warming. I think part of the reason why the current last decade looks like it's, quote, cooling or neutral is we had such a big spike in warming in the 97, 98 El Nino. So you got this big spike in warming, and then it's been kind of flat or maybe going down a little bit. But if you then expand and show the longer record, the last decade has still been some of the warmest years on record. So I'm always willing to be swayed by further observations. If that trend stays flat, I would be a little surprised based on theoretical arguments and also the modeling. My expectation based on the models and theory is that the observations will start to show warming again. Sorry, does that answer your question? That was a little rambling.
Yeah, I guess, well, yeah.
I wasn't, I mean, I can pull some slides out.
So it's just,
I think people are clutching at straws because the forcing factors are still going up. You know, we can't explain the warming since the 1950s, and in particular the warming in the 1970s, without using anthropogenic CO2 as an important warming agent. And so the fact that we have a small decline for a few years, to me, is not a strong indication that warming will not continue in the future.
yeah, I'm not asking to defend that, just, I myself being asked these questions occasionally,
Yeah.
background.
No, I'm trying to remember. I can't remember these folks that wrote the paper. It was kind of an interesting paper. It was in GRL, and I'll dig it out. It's somewhere on my laptop.
On your ocean atmosphere models, how well are they accounting for the episodic events like hurricanes? Are those part of
The models have cyclones, but they're not. They're certainly not as vigorous as a real cyclone because there's not the resolution. So that raises two questions. One is, the models are being used for doing hurricane predictions. Will the strength or number of hurricanes increase? And that gets tough because the models don't resolve them very well. From a climate perspective, the real question is, does the existence of hurricanes have some strong, does the existence of hurricanes structure the large-scale climate in such a way that not having them changes your sensitivity? And I haven't seen a lot of evidence that it would change the sensitivity. I have less confidence, I have only moderate confidence in the predictions of hurricane strength in the future because the models don't resolve them.
Right.
Well.
I guess, my question was more if the models, if there's a difference if they're in or out. Just say on an average year we have
Right.
5 hurricanes. If you ran the model without hurricanes or with an average of 5 hurricanes, does it make a big difference?
Yeah, it's very hard to do that in a coupled model because the coupled model generates its own internal dynamics. So you can't tell it not to form a tropical cyclone. You could probably do a simulation like that where you went back and did a historical simulation with the ocean where you had to go in and basically modify the atmospheric data and excise those hurricanes out, but I haven't seen anybody do that particular study. Other questions? Yeah.
Just asking as a biologist, looking at, you've got low confidence in our effects on higher trophic levels, for instance.
Yeah.
So if we want to come up with experiments, is it useful to go find the modeler and figure out what areas they need their confidence in and tell them we'll be back in 6 months to a year with some numbers, or is it best to just go ahead and do the experiments you were going to do anyway and
well,
someone else sort of into a model?
I'm big on dialogue. I mean, some of this stuff is already, I don't think you necessarily need to find a modeling partner. I mean, there are some projects that it's really good to have a partnership, but some of this is already being written down. So when we did the Ocean Carbon and Biogeochemistry program sponsored an ocean acidification workshop at Scripps a few years ago, and the report is now out. And in that, we detail research strategies for different regions, and there are modeling components for each of those. And so some of these ideas of what are the information needs are already out there. If you're trying to develop specific information for a specific model, then yeah, you would need to develop a partnership or a collaboration with a modeling group. So, Joachim, and then.
Yeah, when you do this modeling, do you look out for hotspots for, say, ocean acidification, and then try and get your resources to that area for further studies?
Right. On the, let's see. Hotspots, at least for the global modeling, these are two different ways of looking at aragonite saturation and how it's going to change in the future. But the top is actually the decrease in aragonite saturation. And so if you looked at this, you'd say, wow, the tropics are the place that are the most sensitive. That's where the magnitude of saturation is going to drop the most. But if you look at it in terms of a percentage drop, you'd say, well, it's the poles, high latitudes, and Arctic. In terms of the global modeling, nothing immediate. You know, I could say the tropics are a hot spot. I could say the Arctic is a hot spot. I'd probably be well-based to say both of those because there are sensitive ecosystems in the Southern Ocean, the Arctic, and the tropics. Nothing really stands out, though, specifically in the global models that I would put a lot of confidence. I certainly would say upwelling systems would be a very interesting place to study because they're already seeing undersaturated water and they're seeing a lot of variability. Similarly with coastal systems. Now, it's a question of, are the ecosystems that are there, since they've already been experiencing a lot of variability, are they resilient to that variability in seawater chemistry? Or are they near a threshold where they've been able to survive the variability, but we're going to push the variability beyond a certain threshold, and suddenly they're going to go, you know, and reach some threshold and collapse. I could see that argument as well. I guess, you know, right now, I don't think we really could prioritize and say, this is it. You know, it's unlike the terrestrial conservation community has very targeted hotspot regions that are based on, you know, a combination of things like biodiversity and susceptibility to human interactions. But a lot of those human interactions are based on very localized and regional perturbations, things like deforestation, fire, changes in water flow, where ocean acidification, because it's an atmosphere-driven process, is really occurring globally. And so, you know, you could argue that, well, from a coral perspective, maybe you want to be in the Indonesian triangle, but that's because that's where the biodiversity is for the corals, not because the OA is going to be stronger there or weaker there. So, I mean, I certainly would say I think we need at least a multi-pronged where we're looking in the tropics because of the coral ecosystems. We know the acidification changes are going to be big there. The high latitudes because, you know, we've got pteropod-based ecosystems, we have krill-based ecosystems. You know, if krill go, that's a big effect. So I think we need to be looking in the Southern Ocean and looking at krill. And I think coastal ecosystems, because that's where a lot of the fisheries are, and that's where people, you know, that's where people impact, you know, that's where people touch the sea is the coasts, whether it's ecotourism or fisheries. And so I think we need to be there as well. Yeah.
Let me preface this by saying that I'm a biologist and ecologist. I'm not completely familiar with all this modeling techniques. Do you think that at a regional or more local scale, that dynamic energy budget models would be useful for studying?
Yeah, I didn't show those because they've gotten a lot of use in some venues, but haven't sort of propagated much into a lot of oceanography yet. Yeah, I think that's a really interesting type of model, and it's really a question. I think some of the places it might be most interesting is to start to look at some of the physiological trade-offs. So, you know, Gretchen Hoffman's done some very nice work. Other people have done nice work where you might be able to acclimate to a certain amount of seawater chemistry change, to a certain amount of ocean acidification, but it's at an energetic cost. And so if you're thinking about the physiology of an organism, you know, what are those trade-offs of I can acclimate so much, but, you know, I might not be able to put as much energy or metabolic resources into defense or reproduction or something else. And so, yeah, I think those models, and then as you fold up into a trophic level, I think have a lot of quite a lot of potential that needs to be explored.
I was reading an article several days ago. Besides penetrating or vertical
Sorry, my ears are all clogged up with this cold.
Yes, we set a treaty's goal as net below 360 ppm
Oh,
for
yeah.
atmospheric CO2.
Yeah.
If anything, the spread on that is like we are going to do without the coral. But in your figure, it looks like the number should be 400 to 500.
Well,
For the Arctic to be transformed.
I mean, I don't think anybody really completely knows where the threshold is for coral reefs, because I think even if we were to stabilize atmospheric CO2 now, there will be some biological inertia over time. I think, there's a whole movement, 350.org, that just had their big thing a week or two ago where they got everybody to show 350. The problem is we're at 390 and the trend is positive. It's going to be really, even these really aggressive scenarios where we're not emitting any carbon to the atmosphere, we actually have net drawdown from technology. This is not ocean drawdown or land drawdown. This is human drawdown. Still is, it's the image, you're not getting back to 350 by the end of this century. So I think there has to be some practicality to this. We need to be able to tell the policymakers where the thresholds are, but I think I think, how to phrase this? The goal of the scientific community is to provide information to society. If you do this, this will happen. These will be the negative consequences. Where we get ourselves in trouble is when we decide we are going to actually make the decisions of what society should do. And I think the 350, although it's great, it raises awareness, it's raising consciousness. Picking that number and assigning that number without looking at all of the economic and technological trade-offs required to get to that number, when we know that the impacts are going to be, there's going to be continuum impacts, there's going to be thresholds, and particularly a number that we're already well past, is, to me, I don't know whether that's going to be politically effective. So.
Wouldn't you expect too that the 120 grams of carbon that is dumped into the ocean, a significant fraction of that is sort of backfilling into the atmosphere? I mean, that they must be included in the model. If you were to suddenly overnight drive the atmosphere down to 350.
Well, yeah, there is actually, you would actually get, we've done that experiment. You actually do get some back release over time because you're shooting below. So if you were to do that, you actually have to continue to suck carbon out and store it in geological reservoirs. There will be some deep mixing. Eventually, the whole ocean will be full of anthropogenic carbon.
Do any of the models take into account that, 2,000 years' time, all that people are coming back up to the surface?
Yeah, actually, Dave Archer is probably one of the leaders in this. Dave's done a lot of very long simulations, thousands of years, and looked at the long-term effects. He likes to say 80% of the fossil fuel carbon is going to end up in the ocean unless we do geological sequestration. And it's both because of the reason it takes so long is because of the slow overturning time scale of the ocean, and then also because on 1,000-year time scales, you start kicking in, changing the calcium carbonate budget. And that also will tend to draw down more atmospheric CO2, but it's on very long time scales. So yeah, Dave's had some nice papers. There have been some other ones as well, but those are the ones that immediately come to mind. Okay, great. Thanks, everybody.